Fantastic. And the only other public announcement is that this class today is dedicated uh, in Refuah Shlema for Esther Bat Sarah, who's in recovery after an accident. Um, okay, so today I wanted to talk about Martin Buber. So we need a lot of introduction here. First of all, some of you, as I myself was, not even familiar with the fact that he was an important Zionist thinker. Many of us are familiar with, Herzl and Jabotinsky, and maybe for those who are well read in their secular Zionist philosophies, they've heard of Achad Ha'am or Pinsker or Hess. And
Mhm.
I know there are lots of people who've written about the question of state of Israel, about Jewish return to the land of Israel in modern times. And Martin Buber was very much among them. Um, he was at the first Zionist Congress and was actually one of the founding editors of the first Zionist newspaper together with Herzl. So he was really there at the beginning of some of the organized movement, although he later moved away from a lot of the organized Zionists and wound up doing some more things on the fringes. So, and we'll come back to that in a minute. So that's just a little bit background about Martin Buber. But first, I wanted to talk to you about why I'm attracted to Martin Buber Zionism and this topic in general. So this is the book that I've been studying. It's called On Zion: A History of an Idea. It's by Martin Buber, and he didn't write this book. It was a series of lectures that he gave at Hebrew U in 19, I think 43, 44, that were then recorded into a book in Hebrew and then ultimately translated into English and other languages. Um, and Martin Buber offers um, a an approach to Zionism which I found to be incredibly impactful and incredibly refreshing. And what I mean by that is that um, the Zionism that Martin Buber expresses really gets at the question of why, and not just the why on a modern level, right? There's lots of modern thinkers in the Enlightenment period who are talking about the Jewish question, who are talking about the question of what is Jewish peoplehood, what is Jewish land, what does it mean for a people to have a land? But Buber really traces his philosophy and ideology to biblical and Talmudic and medieval sources. He was an incredibly well-read individual, and he tries to situate his Zionist philosophy, his Zionist ideology, not just in modern questions about what do the Jewish people need today, but also the question of like what is the Jewish project in general, in a broader sense. What does God want from us? What has God commanded to us? What have the rabbis developed around God's ideas? I think that's really incredible. You see this in other figures like Rabbi Teichtal or Rav Kook, who describe this. But what's really fascinating and powerful about Buber's approach is that Buber was secular. It's really important to remember Buber had a really interesting childhood. Um, he grew up secular initially, but then was sent to live with his grandparents in Lvov, who were incredibly traditional, academic but traditional, where he became very well versed in Torah and Gemara and Chassidut and Halacha, and then ultimately came back to the major cities in Europe where he was, entered into the academic world and left most of his religious practice behind. Buber makes the distinction between religion and religiosity, and he's dispensed with religion and religious practice, but ultimately felt a deep connection to God and to the Jewish tradition and to the Jewish mission. So those are really important things to know about Buber. And I've always been attracted to thinkers who kind of give us a why, who kind of give us a purpose, right? We can study things all day. We can study the laws all day. We can study the Chumash. We can study, for those, the book of Daniel when we get after Sukkot. And these are people who are dealing with questions. How do we navigate? What does it mean that? Where do we go from here? But the question of like trying to give our Jewish life and our Jewish world an arc and a narrative that spans across time and history and traces back to our original texts until today, I find that project to be very important and powerful for my own religious life. Right? No longer is it something that's like in a vacuum, but something that's part of something much larger. And Buber attempts to do that, and therefore I think that's awesome. Another reason why I'm attracted to Buber's Zionism and Zionist thought in general is because I've really, I guess in my adulthood, I've really felt a lot of like confusion around Zionist actions in America. And what I mean by that um, is that like my connection to Medinat Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael and Klal Yisrael is like I don't want to say unparalleled. I'm sure everyone else here feels similarly to me about these places and these peoples and our hopes and aspirations. I spent time learning 2 years in yeshiva in Israel. Almost all of my family lives in Israel. From a very young age, we were a Zionist family, and we traveled to Israel and we learned about Israel. Um, but oftentimes, I feel um, disconnected. I feel disconnected from sort of the practice of Zionism in America today. And what I mean by that is that it essentially like falls into um, one major category of Israel advocacy, and this might be true on campus for college kids, or on Facebook for anyone who's on Facebook, or in political lobbying, that the way we express our Zionism in America is by lobbying for the safety and the security of Israel. And I think that, for the most part, characterizes a lot of the ways we relate to the Zionist project, right? We care about how is Israel perceived in the world, how is Israel perceived in America, what kind of funding, what kind of security, what kind of alliances it gets. You know, is Israel safe, and what can we do from afar to ensure that Israel is safe? Um, but I think as religious Jews, and I anyone who's on this call is a religious Jew, regardless of your practice. Religious Jews, in the sense of Buber's religiosity. Religious Jews, Jews who feel connected to our history, Jews who feel connected to our texts, Jews who feel connected to God or the idea of God or questions about God. We need to be asking ourselves something more than just um, when is the next lobbying mission, or who am I voting for? Those are, don't get me wrong, those are important things to do. But we have to be asking ourselves, like, what is my relationship with this place? What are my hopes and dreams for this place? What is my how do I fit into this narrative of Jewish history as it relates to not just Medinat Israel, the state of Israel, but the land of Israel and the people of Israel? What are we there to do, and what is our role in participating in that? And so I think exploring and learning and reading about various Zionist thinkers and philosophers helps give us language and helps gives us ideas to then hold on to and motivate and activate us in important ways. And so I feel like Martin Buber in this book really taps into that a lot. Um, the third thing that I think is important, or why I'm drawn to this, is I grew up in a very religious Zionist community. Um, and what I mean by that is that our Zionism was very tied into religion. And I spent 2 years learning in Yeshivat Har Etzion, which is in Gush Etzion. And the Zionism is incredibly religious and messianic. Um, and what I mean by that is that there's this belief, as I've articulated, that the actions that we take, the places we live, the places we hike, the texts we learn have messianic purpose to them, right? Um, you could feel that about without Israel. You could feel that the mitzvot you do, the good deeds you do, the keeping Shabbat or the helping old people across the street or whatever it is you do in your life, um, you could feel those things are somehow metaphysically bringing Messiah. Religious Zionism says, yes, yes, in addition to all of those actions, actually settling the land of Israel, being in the land of Israel, walking the land of Israel, is a religious value and brings forth the potential for Messiah. And this resonates. This is true in our tefillah. We talk about in our tefillah l'shalom medinat Yisrael, the prayer for the welfare of the state of Israel. We say Reshit smichat gulatenu, right? The founding of the state of Israel is part of bringing the ultimate redemption. It's part of bringing messianic times. And the religious Zionism that I grew up with and was part of and am still part of in some ways is very much connected to settling the land and the land being a value in it of itself. And this is based in ideas that Rav Kook wrote about the land and that his son Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook really popularized. That the land of Eretz Yisrael is important, that it belongs to the Jewish people, that the Jewish people settling the land is part of bringing the Messiah. And what I'm curious about Buber and what I think he does is he a little bit starts to challenge that idea. He doesn't question the importance of the land of Israel. In fact, it's very much at the center, but he begins to sort of try to understand more about what that actually looks like and what it means for us to be inhabitants of the land of Israel. What are the responsibilities that are required of us? What are we trying to accomplish by living in Israel and by supporting Israel? So I found that Buber offers a little bit of a counter narrative, steeped in the sources, to some of the more prevailing ideologies that I'm familiar with. And then like the final thing I would say is that I grew up in B'nai Akiva, and maybe some other people grew up in B'nai Akiva as well. And a lot of times on Shabbos afternoon or at camps, there was a lot of like, sports and games and activities. But there was also like not only ideology, but there was studying and learning. And I've never been able to track it down, but I once read an article, I think in 8th or 9th grade, by Chaim Weitzman. And it was something about like Israel, the labor, avodah, the labor movement, and the Jewish people. And it was taught by Ilan Tokayer, who was like an incredible young educator from Teaneck, who actually died tragically young from a brain aneurysm. And so I haven't been able to find that article again, but I remember sitting in the kitchen of an old synagogue in Northeast Philadelphia, reading this and just being like, I cannot believe that people actually get to write about Israel and what it means. It was the first time I'd ever been exposed to kind of the philosophy of Zionism, to these questions about Jewish peoplehood. And in my like study later in life, I've always tried to like recreate that or come back to that allure. And I really found, more than other studying I've done, reading Buber's book on Zion really captured that for me in a powerful way. I would be remiss if I didn't thank, he's not on the call, but Ben Sion Ferziger, who's a shul member. Maybe many of you know or have heard of his grandmother, Mrs. Ferziger, lived in Riverdale for a long time. Now she lives in Israel most of the year. But him and I studied this book together throughout the pandemic, and that was sort of how I got to be invested and involved in it. So everything I say is based on my own reading, but also based on conversations we had in studying and learning it together. We have like 40 minutes left today and an hour next week to go through like a 200-page book, which we're obviously not going to be able to do. So what I did was I selected a few passages for us to read together. I'll try to give us some background or expand a little bit upon it, but then I wanted to sort of read it and think about it out loud together and hear your responses, so we can sort of get a sense of like what is Martin Buber's philosophical positions, What does he believe? What is he trying to accomplish in this writing? I need to be clear about two other things, or at least explicit about two other things. The first thing is that Martin Buber was, even though he was part of early Zionist movement and a very important philosopher. I think everyone on this call has heard of I, thou, are familiar with his ideas either directly from him or from his students or people who've just continued to use his language. Um, he was really kind of excluded from a lot of Zionist thinking because of his relatively left-wing views. He was part of a group of people who were part of the believed in the Brit Shalom, the idea that Israel and Palestinians should share, Jews and Palestinians should share one state. And he was a proponent of that for the many decades leading up to the state, and even after the partition plan, still believing that that would be the ideal way of living in the land of Israel. So that could be like problematic or like outside the fold in some way for some folks on this call. For other folks on this Zoom, maybe feel like, oh great, this is my compatriot. So I think I do want to like be explicit about that. The second thing is there's like a funny thing they tell about his coming to Hebrew U is that he was like a public intellectual in Europe, and when he in the late 30s, when he wanted to come to Israel, the Hebrew U professors rejected him. They said he wasn't rigorous enough of a scholar, and so he wasn't allowed in the philosophy or the history department. And then later, with the rise of Nazism, he kind of forced himself to move to Israel, and they let him into the sociology department. So this Martin Buber, who's this like incredibly intellectual philosopher, incredible influential philosopher in our time, at the time was sort of like looked down upon by some of his other colleagues. But we're grateful that he wound up having a position at Hebrew U and was able to teach and develop students and continue to write. Those are like the initial waves of introduction. Is there any comments or reactions or responses to this introduction? Yeah, Tzvi? Tzvi, I actually can't hear you, unfortunately. You're unmuted, but I think something's going on with your microphone. All right, Tzvi, while you're working on that, I'm gonna turn over to Lance for a minute. I still can't hear you, Tzvi.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay, a couple of thoughts. And one is that Buber really was not in favor of even the two-state solution. I think Buber was not in favor of a Jewish state. My understanding is, I could be wrong. And he was very strongly, as you pointed out, very left, very strongly in favor of the Palestinians. And I really think that today he would be in a very difficult position, because I think today we are in the post-two-state solution. And I think that for the Palestinians, the best situation would be that they would be part of a Jewish state, which would be halachic, and it would be completely governed by Jews. In other words, there would be no Christians, there would be no Palestinians, it would be completely Jews. And of course, my position is the position of Rabbi Meir Kahane, and I think Rabbi Meir Kahane, probably you think of him as a nutcase, but I also think the position would be shared by Ari Fuld. And Ari Fuld is someone who comes from here, Riverdale. And I think it was just an amazing human being, and was slaughtered like Rabbi Kahane for, I guess, his beliefs and his position, supporting what you might call a right-wing position. The other point I'd like to make, which I think you would totally disagree with, is we hope for the Messianic era. And we make the assumption that things are going to be better in the Messianic era than they are now. And my sense is that the Messianic era era would be hell. And if you look around the world today and you see Highland Park and you see the wildfires and you see Ukraine and you see Hamas and you see all and Iran, I just question whether we're not in the Messianic era and we're not in hell.
Okay. Thanks, Lance, for both comments. I think it's I wanna sort of like caution us, or like I reckon that we can't read this book without the knowledge of the last, he wrote this in the 40s. So I recognize that the last 70 years has heavily influenced our way of thinking about Zionism, thinking about the state of Israel, thinking about what are possible or probable or likely or ideal or solutions to the conflict in Israel. I totally recognize that, and I want us to try to read this text like on its own terms to understand what is the idea that he's getting at after we feel like we have some kind of understanding. And I don't know if we're going to really fully achieve that in a mere 2 hours. But after that, then I would want to talk about how we see that fitting in his vision, how that would manifest itself today. And this is a conversation for another time, but Buber really had this like theological and anarchic philosophy about what religious life would look like in Israel. And so that's like its own kind of conception and thing to unpack. So I don't really know exactly how he imagines the state working, but I think you're right to say that an exclusively Jewish state in the land of Israel was not something that he saw as the ideal. So I'm going to turn over to others, Lance, and we can
May I
continue
just
the
make one quick
conversation.
point, and that is that I think Jabotinsky was basically in line with Buber.
Okay, well, we'll learn more about that as we go. Yes, Graham.
Oh, wow. Well, I'm only familiar a little bit from college with his book I and Thou,
Yeah.
and I really I thought it was a wonderful book, but I think that Buber gives us a practice, and so in seeing every person, every phenomenon, every process as sacred. That's where the thou comes in, as I recall, and he wanted to make the differentiation between I and thou and I and it, which is it's differentiating between seeing things not just as an object to be made to conform to our wishes, but as a confirmation of the divine in our world. Sounds almost like a little bit like my idea, anyway, of the Kabbalah.
Yeah.
Sort of a magical world. Moving from I and it to I and thou was importantly overcoming arrogance, which at the time I read I had big time, and practicing gentleness, kindness, and overcoming the urge to impose an agenda on the sacred on a sacred world, right? And sort of overcoming self-preoccupation and really reaching out radically. So I think Buber was talking about letting go of self-absorption and awakening to the inherent magic of the world. So, and then when you talk about Israel, I mean, I'm not no offense, but no presumption of understanding in depth of what the Jewish people have gone through and what they aspire to. But in order to be worthy of citizenship in the land of Israel, according to Buber, it would be to make this journey from this journey to the land of milk and honey. We need to be aware of making a journey from I and it, like seeing people and places and things as objects to be moved around and manipulated for our own interests, and to move from that to I and thou, which is in our own feeling for life. L'chaim. It's really
Beautiful.
probably where he was coming from.
Thank you, Graham. Yeah, I think you can see a lot of, in his philosophies around Israel, you can see a lot of his other sort of broader worldview peeking through in terms of seeing the other as a you or as a thou rather than an object to be dealt with. Thanks for that expansion, Graham. I think at this point it makes sense for us to jump in the text and see where it goes. Tzvi, did you wanna? I know you had your hand up first. I still can't hear you. I'm sorry. If you want to call in with the phone, there's a dial-in number on the flyer, and then we could hear you on the phone. If that, you'll see if you can work it out, or you could write into the chat if you want as well, because I do want to hear. You're an important person here on this call, and I want to hear what you have to say. All right. Great. So let's Can everybody see this? So this is from his preface, and I think this really touches on something that Lance just brought up, and I want to read it explicitly. Estelle, will you read for us?
The Hebrew edition of this book appeared in 1944. In May 1948, the state of Israel was proclaimed, but it has not proved necessary to alter anything in the text of the present work, which is intended to shed light not on the history of a political enterprise, but on that of a religious idea, or rather on the spiritual history of the faith. How much of the latter the political enterprise and its consequences will be able to realize will naturally be revealed only in the course of several generations. But it is only right that as long as such a spiritual reality lives, history should be responsible to it, rather than it should be responsible to history.
Okay, his writing can be a little bit dense, so does anyone want to summarize what they think he's saying here? Because I think he's making a really important point that actually directly responds to Lance's opening comment.
Very interesting. But the point is what about spiritual reality? What is spiritual reality?
Okay, good.
I've got a problem with that.
Good. So what Buber, the way I understand this passage is that Buber says, look, listen, in my book, I'm going to present like a series and a set of ideals. I'm going to set a series of spiritual aspirations. Okay. And it could be that you might think that, okay, well, after the state of Israel, or after the War of 48, or after the War of 67, or after failed Oslo, therefore we should be reevaluating what is the thing we want or what we aspire to, that we should allow the last 70 years to influence what our vision is. And he totally rejects that. He says, no, the whole point of having a spiritual aspiration, a religious idea, the spiritual history of a faith, of saying that we're part of some narrative arc about what we're trying to accomplish in this world and what we're trying to accomplish in Israel. The whole idea is that becomes something that we hold up as an ideal to strive for, even when history seems to get in the way. Even when things feel impossible to accomplish those goals, even when there aren't partners for peace, or even when there has been horrible acts of murder and killing and terrible political realities, Buber makes the claim here that unpacking and holding on to a political ideal, religious ideal, is something that history should be responsible to. That the historical actors, people in government, activists, people like you and me need to be responsible to this ideal and this idea, rather than the other way around, rather than refracting the idea and the ideal to match what's going on, we switch it to the opposite direction. Yeah,
But
Graham.
are you
That is radical.
are you
What?
equating religious with spiritual? I mean,
Yeah, so if I
are
want to
they
go, yeah, I
equal
want to,
words?
yeah, I want to go back, Estelle, to what I said early on, that when Buber uses the term religious, he doesn't mean religion in terms of uh, Shabbat and Kashrut, which weren't things that he weren't part of his set of practices. He's talking about like a spiritual vision for the world, some kind of relationship with God, or intentionality or hopes or dreams about what the world or what Israel could be. That's what he means by religious. So he uses Jewish texts. He uses the Torah. He uses the Gemara. He uses the Zohar. He uses the Kuzari. He uses Rabbi Nachman. He uses Rav Kook to try to build out what this religious ideal is, this spiritual ideal that's not necessarily connected to practice. Does that make sense? Practice in terms of like halachic practice in the way that we talk about being religious today.
In other words, he wants history to be responsible to all the ideals that we were thinking of over the years, rather than the reverse.
Exactly. Exactly.
Uh,
Yeah, Graham.
well, I thought it was just really shocking, really, to me, this paragraph, because it seems like Buber is saying that we must take history, we must make history ourselves, and not
Not
by being
not
by being
have it, yeah.
by being preoccupied with our history. We should not let history make us. So, and that's pretty radical. I mean, it's
Well, we're
absolutely
making
true.
history as we live.
Right. But we're also rising above our conditioning, our religious and social conditioning,
Are we?
as as an ideal, as an aspiration to get free of our history.
We
That's
can
what
never
I'm-
be free of our history.
That's what I'm hearing him say.
That's
No,
we
not
can never
not
be.
All
not
right.
completely, but it's just
Thank
it's an
you.
ideal aspiration.
Thank you, Graham, and thank you, Estelle. Thank you for your reactions and your insights on this. Other comments or responses? Yes, Vivian. Vivian, you have to unmute first.
I was thinking that in terms of what he's expecting is that we should not even regard history. We should not use history in any of this. It's avoiding it or disregarding it. He's not mentioning anything about the Holocaust. I mean, that in 1944 was. We knew what was going on, and there's no reference and no thought about it. It's like ignoring history.
It's a really, thanks, Vivian. It's a really interesting point, right? Also, I think your video just turned up. I'm not sure why, but it's a really interesting point. We say like, okay, I get that you're presenting these kinds of spiritual ideals. It's a really beautiful pushback, but like, what happens when reality really just does change? What happened when we have moments like the Holocaust that really break what maybe our conception was about what was needed in this world? Maybe we should allow that to really alter or affect our positions or our philosophy. And it's interesting. Buber. So I'm getting a little feedback from somebody. So what I'm going to mute everybody and then just unmute when you're after I call on you to talk, and you can raise your hand either in your screen or using the little raise hand button on the thing. So they say Buber, who was a big believer in developing a relationship with the other, and that was both humans, but it was really in the service of also being able to develop a relationship with God. And he's quoted as saying after the Shoah, being like, I don't know how anybody could have a relationship with a God that would allow this to happen. So it's clear that Buber himself was responsive to that in terms of other aspects of his philosophy. And I think it's a really good question of saying, you know, all of the, even the early Zionist thinkers who were experiencing anti-Semitism and writing about anti-Semitism and writing about the need of the state of Israel to counter or to be a safe haven in the context of growing and rising anti-Semitism in enlightened Europe. None of them could have really none of them really anticipated the scale of the Shoah and what its implications would then be for the Jewish people in the land of Israel. So I think it does appear to me, Vivian, as an important, outstanding question, and I'm grateful for you to raise it. Robert Niederman? I don't think I know you, Robert.
Yeah.
So you could just also introduce yourself. That'd be great. You have to unmute. There you go. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm new. I'm from Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
Oh, beautiful.
I heard about your program here, so I was interested. So what Martin Buber brings up for me, you know, it's very attractive to have this idea of I, thou, and to have this deep connection with people. And that's something I try to cultivate in my life. At the same time, it sort of brings up the two themes of Gevura and Rachamim, you know, compassion and also strength and protection. And so I'm thinking about this week's portion and, you know, the tribes of Israel saying, you know, we want to stay here in Gideon. Well, we're going to create cities of fortified cities, and then we're going to go and help you conquer the land. And I think, you know, in order to have compassion in our lives, we need to protect our people. So within that protection, we can have this sense of connection. If we don't have protection, then we're just going to get wiped out by the hostile forces that are out there. We can't ignore them. That's what the state of Israel is there to do, I think. And I think that's why many Jews, particularly after 67, have felt so much pride and strength that we're not just at the mercy of people who want to destroy us. We need protection first, and then we can have maybe an I-thou connection with people who are safe to have this connection.
Yeah. Buber takes sort of an opposite approach, as you may have guessed. And he really believes that position or posture is undermining to the ability to connect with others. It is an idealism. It might be described as naive by some, or as, you know, silly, or just self-immolating or something. But it is instrumental to his philosophy that he really was not into violence, even in you know, of course you have to protect in some level, but there really wasn't. He often sidestepped that in the way he describes his ideals and values. So I think it's an important thing to recognize that there is a way in which this book, or the aspirations that are articulated, that I've already said in his name, or that we'll read together, are aspirational and are somewhat academic and spiritual, and says that how they're applied may be different. But I think what he's saying in the preface here is that they're important that we live with them or hold on to them, even as we move through our historical moment. Thanks for that comment, Robert. And nice to meet you. Jack?
I thank you. For me, when I read on Zion recently, the meaning of this introduction really became very meaningful to me at the end of the book, when Buber discusses what was then the contemporaneous Zionist history, and goes over the fact that the early Zionists considered a lot of places for a potential homeland for the Jewish people. They looked at Argentina, they looked at Uganda, as you know. Buber makes it very clear why it had to be Eretz Israel, why it couldn't be those places, because he spent this whole effort in the book, as you said, going through long centuries of spiritual attachment of the Jewish people to this particular place. And so it becomes really very clear at the end of the book what he's saying, that the reason why it has to be Eretz Israel, why it couldn't have been Argentina or Uganda or any of the other places they considered, is because it was in our spiritual blood. going back to Torah and Talmud, and all through, he traces through centuries of spiritual writing and scholarship, what our attachment is to this particular place. And that's really where, to me, it really comes home.
Beautiful, beautiful. And I think, it's an interesting, I'm grateful for that point, Jack. And I think it dovetails nicely, or at least responds in some way to Robert's point, or to the sense that we have, well, what about safety? What about the Shoah? What about sort of this question of our existence? Is that not the most important thing that needs to be solved first? And in Buber's world of spiritual connection, of the neshama, of the heart that is connected to the land of Israel, that has responsibilities to the land of Israel as part of our historical and covenantal connection with God, he says, like, that has to be the primary thing, even before thinking of these other questions of, well, where is the safest place to be a Jew? And so I think that's an important point. That's an important point as well. So thank you very much, Jack, and I'm glad you enjoyed the book. Lance, go for it.
Okay, I want to take back everything I said about Martin Buber. I've completely changed my interpretation. I'm serious. Look at the very last line. History should be responsible to it rather than it should be responsible to history. Now that is a poetic and rhetorical device called chiasmus. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. That is chiasmus. It means that the it and the it are together, and then the responsible are outside. It's not a logical sequence. And what I saw in a kind of revelation is, and you think about I and thou, I think what Graham was talking about is absolutely on target. I now see Buber as a poet. More than that, I see Buber as a psalmist.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the history, the philosophy, the religion, all that is irrelevant when you think about what he is doing with his text, with his language. His language is symbolic. His language, it's poetic. And I just saw this. I mean, I did a little research. I spent several hours yesterday trying to do research on Martin Buber. And the things I said before, I now disavow. I'm totally wrong in that the way I read Martin Buber. And I think that Graham is probably, much closer to understanding Martin Buber than I was.
Yeah. Thanks, Lance, for just your honest reflection and your ability to pivot in reading it. I think it's right. I think it's why, even though Martin Buber is secular in the kind of the superficial sense of the word, right? Like, he wasn't he rejected kind of the traditional Judaism that he learned in his childhood. He's like a deeply religious, poetic, spiritual figure, and all of his writings, his philosophy and his political philosophy that he describes here, very much feels steeped in that kind of mode, more so than philosophical inquiry or what politically makes sense. And it could be that's why the other professors at Hebrew U rejected him, because they said, like, this guy is a rabbi. He's not a professor, right? And like, he may be a secular rabbi, but I agree that what comes through in his writing is a rabbinic posture, not in a sense of although he did kind of look like a rabbi, like with no kippah, but like what comes through is like a spiritual, sermonizing, inspiring building of a religious and spiritual world that he thinks that we need to hold up in our minds. And for me, that's the language that I speak. I became a rabbi because that's the kind of work that I want to engage in, and what I believe about our approach to the world. And it means that I don't always have the answers to the political questions, and I'm okay with that. I didn't study political science. I studied rabbinics and Judaism, and so I think there's something very powerful about that here. So thanks, Lance, for framing that for us in this way. Okay, let's jump here to page in his introduction. Let's read the idea of Zion, and you'll see the poetic language is it's tough. So we're going to go slow and work our way through it. The idea of Zion. Robert, would you read for us? Because this, I think, directly responds to the point, directly is in conversation with some of the things you said. So the idea of Zion right here, the second line down.
The idea of Zion is rooted in deeper regions of the earth and rises into loftier regions of the air. And neither its deep roots nor its lofty heights, neither its memory of the past or its ideal for the future, both of the self-same texture, must be repudiated. Should I go on?
Yeah, please, till the end of the paragraph.
If Israel renounces the mystery, it renounces the heart of reality itself. National forms without the eternal purpose from which they have arisen signify the end of Israel's specific fruitfulness. The free development of the latent power of the nation without a supreme value to give it purpose and direction does not mean regeneration, but the mere sport of a common self-deception behind which spiritual death lurks in ambush. If Israel desires less than it's intended to fulfill, then it will even fail to achieve the lesser goal.
Good. Okay, so the way I understand this paragraph, and I welcome other thoughts or reactions, is he's saying, listen, there is a way in which Zionism, thinking about the Jewish peoplehood as like a thing in and of itself that needs to be protected, but without some kind of spiritual ideal or aspiration, he views that as really problematic. He says that the thing that Judaism provides, that the Jewish people can do in the land of Israel, is a unique contribution and gift and purpose, and that if we forget about it or ignore it for the sake of just the state of Israel as a political body or a safe haven for Jewish people without connection to kind of these religious ideals, then there's something really missing. And not only that, but we won't even succeed in the basic goal. Reactions or thoughts on this? Yeah, Mirna, please. Mirna first. Estelle, Mirna first, and then I'll call you. It's okay. I'm just trying to make sure we hear from different voices.
No, I just wanted to ask, is he saying that if Israel doesn't fulfill, it should be the end of Israel?
Yeah,
Is that what he's saying?
He does believe that. Not the end of the Jewish people.
In other words, it couldn't be an ordinary country.
Correct. And he feels that when it is, and he looks at Jewish history and the history of the Bible and of the prophets, what he unpacks in the book is that the Jewish people are exiled from the land of Israel twice, right? There's been 2 times where we had political power and we had the opportunities for spiritual and religious fulfillment and to fulfill God's dream or promise, and we failed. And what God did was God ended the political body of Israel at that time. And so Buber is not attached to this time carrying any less responsibility or obligation than those previous moments, which feels scary. It does, and it should feel scary because we know how important this place is and important it is for the Jewish people. And yet his point is,
what is he suggesting?
So let's hold on for a second, Estelle. Mirna, you have to unmute, Mirna. Sorry, you were muted and then you were unmuted and now you're muted again.
Do it. Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. What I don't understand, what is his core? The religious ideal is it all comes from God. When we're punished in the prophets, why? Because we've left God's ways. What is his core? What specifically is his core?
Yeah.
for all these things that he wants to achieve.
Yeah, he really believes, at least like in what, and we'll see some of these passages as we move forward in the next this week and next week, or probably next week at this point. He really believes in a land that is governed by God, not by man, which is like a little bit of like a radical notion.
So wait a minute. So God is, so there's a God in his perspective.
Correct. There's a God in his perspective.
And he
but it-
believes the Haredim were right.
No, so it's not, he doesn't believe in a theocratic state. He actually believes in a relatively anarchic land,
Yeah.
one in which people directly commune with God. I know you're gonna be like, this is so crazy, and that would never work. And his point would be like, okay, but let's hold on to these ideals and think about this. He really believed in people's individual spiritual relationship with God. And for him, one of the things that's the core for him, Mirna, is the ability and the challenge of the Jewish people coexisting with Palestinians in the land of Israel. It actually winds up serving as at the heart of his philosophy in terms of his modern conception of the land of Israel and the state of Israel. It says that the Jewish people have a unique challenge, and that one he believes our history situates us for, have a unique challenge and the unique obligation to learn how to live with another people who would otherwise seem to be our mortal enemy. And he said,
Have to deal with political reality. And if you're not dealing with the political reality, then you're living in a
you don't need to, Mirna, we're just studying Buber. So don't worry. His
Yeah.
his compatriots said the same thing to him, Mirna. These critiques that you're offering, it's true. He was ostracized from a lot of the political Zionist camp because they said this is just not based in reality. And his argument always was, and we'll see it inside, his argument always was, I hear what you're saying. I know it feels impossible, but this impossible task is our very purpose. Well, he actually
Oh,
says it
boy.
explicitly. He says the task that you view as impossible, that you view as politically unable to ever occur, he says this is the main thing that God wants from us, is to be able to solve this in a way where we can coexist together. And I don't know, I feel very both like, I feel the same thing you feel, Mir, and I'm like, come on, that's not real, and they're gonna kill us. I feel those things. I feel those things, and also I
Merit.
feel so attached and inspired by his saying, well, what is the thing? What is the ideal? What is the thing we're trying to accomplish? And we'll look at some of these passages inside next week because we're almost out of time. But he really believes that that if the Jewish people could figure out how to coexist peacefully in the land of Israel, that would model a messianic ideal for the rest of the world. That
But it's
until
got
this
to be
moment,
two-sided.
Estelle, wait. Just listen
Yeah.
before we respond. Let's listen and hear and think and feel, and before we respond. He believes that if the Jewish people can figure out how to engage in this process, that is the messianic ideal that would serve as a model for all conflict around the world in all of time. Okay? And so I don't, like, you might hear that and be like, this is Narishkeit, or like, Ezra, get your head out of the clouds, or like, get out of the ashram. And I'm telling you that, like, no, on a religious, spiritual level, when I read the prophets, when I read King David, when I read the Torah that describes like the world in which we're trying to inhabit, a world that I think we all would aspire to, where like conflict and murdering and killing of peoples and fighting over land doesn't occur. That's a thing we want. And so Buber, maybe you don't want that. That's the thing I want. I speak for myself. That's the thing I want. I want that for the whole world. And so Buber makes the claim or the belief that like Israel is uniquely situated to model that for the whole world. That the land of Israel with its competing claims on the land, with peoples who have unique histories and connections to the land, with people who feel like they can't figure out how to coexist, that if they could figure out how to coexist in the world, in this land of Israel, that would be a spiritual paradigm for the rest of the world, and that would usher in or model what a messianic time could look like. I don't know. You might laugh at me. I find that to be very beautiful, a beautiful hope and dream, and something that I aspire to, and something that I think Buber would argue is that we have to be beholden to. We have to always be holding that up as the ideal. That's the goal,
It's
and
great.
everything else needs to be in
To the
service of
tango.
that goal. Bev gets the next comment. Probably the next and last comment. Yeah.
Okay.
Up. Try again.
Am I unmuted? Can you hear
You're
me?
unmuted.
Yes, I'm
Yeah.
muted.
Yes.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Well, I have to say, if one is at all an optimist, there is so much hope in what he says. People have said so many things over the years. That's impossible. That's impossible. That people will fly, that whatever it is, that will reach the moon and Mars. And eventually it happens. It happens. And so I believe that he is just so in advance and so far removed from the practical people today, but in his thoughts to
Mhm.
vision a world to be, a messianic world. And I believe it will happen.
Thanks, Bev. Appreciate your vote of confidence. I'm sure Martin Buber does as well. I believe that too. I want to read this final passage of the introduction because I think it kind of captures this debate between this not optimism but this dreaming and vision that I love the way you put it, Bev, in contrast with kind of a realism or a reality that seems to negate our ability to have this vision. With every new encounter of this people with this land, i.e. the Jewish people with the land of Israel, the task is set afresh. But every time it is rooted in the historical situation and its problems. If it is not mastered, what has already been achieved will fall into ruin. Once it is really mastered, this may be the beginning of a new kind of human society. To be sure, the problem proves to be more difficult every time it is tackled. It is more difficult to set up an order based on justice in the land if one is under the jurisdiction of a foreign power, as after the return from Babylon, right? When the Jewish people come from Babylon, they're trying to rebuild the Jewish state along with the Second Temple, and they're still under
Yes.
foreign rule. Then if one is comparatively free to determine one's own way of life, as after the first appropriation of the land. And it is still more difficult if one has to reckon with the coexistence of another people in the same country of cognate origin and language, but mainly foreign in tradition, structure, and outlook. And if this vital fact has to be regarded as an essential part of the problem. On the other hand, there seems to, right, he names the fact that the reality is going to make this really complicated. He sees that. On the other hand, there seems to be a high purpose behind the increasingly difficulty of the task. Even in the life of the individual, what has once been neglected can never be made up for in the same sphere and under the same conditions. But one is sometimes allowed to make amends for lost opportunities in a quite different situation, in a quite different form. And it is significant that the new situation is more contradictory and the new form is more difficult to realize than the old, and that each fresh attempt demands an even greater exertion to fulfill the task. For such is the hard but not ungracious way of life itself. The same process seems to be true of the life of Israel. He says, when the Jewish people first come to the land of Israel and conquer it in these parshiot that we're reading, that you referenced, Robert, right? That was the easiest time they had to build the kingdom of God, to try to create this society that they had made a covenant with God about. In the second time, even though they were under foreign rule, that was another opportunity. He says, now is the hardest time to do it. We have to contend with the fact that there's another people there who have over 1,000 years of history and culture related to this land. And he says the same way in your own life, in a person's individual life, they come up and again against the same kinds of conflicts and problems and questions from when you're 7 years old to 15 years old to 26 years old and 32 years old. And I don't know what happens after that because that's how old I am, but the rest of you can tell me. I imagine it stays the same. It gets harder and harder, but the challenge is still there and it's something that could be accomplished. And so he really believes that, yes, the problem of the conflict in Israel, of Jews and Palestinians sharing a state or sharing a land, or however you want to frame it, is harder than anything the Jewish people have tried to accomplish. And he says that is the task that's in front of us. And the rest of the book is making the argument about why that's the case. And we're going to look at some of his passages and details and arguments. And I will seriously offer that if there's a group of folks who, after these 2 classes, want to study the book more in depth together, maybe chapter by chapter or section by section, I would be very supportive of doing a course on that over the course of the coming year. And I would happily lead that and teach that together with you all. So that's sort of like our introduction to Martin Buber Zionism. I appreciate the energy. I appreciate the pushback. I think your questions are all real and important, and I think he does his best to try to address them, or to say we have to be thinking beyond those questions in order to figure out what it is we're really trying to accomplish in this world, what it is we're really trying to accomplish as the Jewish people, and what it is we're trying to accomplish as the Jewish people in the land of Israel. So
Beautiful.
that's what I have for today. Welcome any comments or reactions in the chat or by email. But for now, the class is officially over, and I'm going to stop the recording. So thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
all.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you and Shabbat Shalom.